great to see everybody here. It's nice to be able to get to see old friends and colleagues again.
And our residents as well. You know, we'll work with that.
30 stories worth of fire hose seems like a lot, doesn't it?
Anybody wants to talk to Tom or I about what that looks like?
Looking at penetrations, looking at the fire stopping elements we're putting in buildings.
That's another sort of energy sustainable technology that sort of is great but works against us. It also burns the grass in my yard.
Okay, thank you for attending, and thank you, Russ, for this opportunity to speak. So, HSG 168, 3rd edition, Joint Code of Practice, version 10, I think it's 0.1 now. What's changed? So, you don't need to know that because you've seen that already. What this isn't going to be is an absolute detailed breakdown of what's changed. When I did this for my company, and I'm sure people in the crowd have done it, it turned up to be about 30 pages on HSG 168 by itself. There's lots of little word changes, so what I'm going to try and do is keep it to the theme, keep it and break it down in the sections as we go through, and then with the Joint Code of Practice at the end, there's always more detail, as we know in the Joint Code of Practice. We'll enhance and bring out the details within that, but you do need to read both sets of documents. The devil is in the detail, as they say. So, 3rd edition of the HSG 168 is largely a tidy up of previous editions, reflecting changes in other allied guidance and regulations. It also acknowledges the emergence of new technologies which are gaining popularity on sites and adding new hazards. And we're going to talk, other speakers are going to talk about that through the process. I'll touch on it, but stuff like electric batteries and charging will get dealt with later in the presentation. So, what does HSG 168 look like now? It's 3 parts now, 4 appendices, and the addition of a glossary. So there's now an explanation on some of those big words at the back end and some definitions that inform you a little bit more as to what we're talking about. In the introduction section then, we now have the definition of what a complex site is. Okay, so it is defined, and obviously tall buildings comes into that section. There's also an insertion of a summary table to reinforce the relationship between fire safety and all duty holders under CDM. This table also indicates what that responsibility might be and recommended actions to be undertaken. This isn't in addition to Appendix 4, which has all the detail in, but is definitely driving and reinforcing CDM requirements for all parties, from client through to contractor, principal designer, in between. So, going for the rest of this, I'm going to break it down into the 3 parts and summarise each as we go through. Part 1, as I'm sure we're all aware, deals with the fire risk assessment. What we have now is a nice little graphic front end, okay, and this visually describes the 5 steps that are recorded in HSG 168. It's a nice little summary document. Step 2 of the fire risk assessment has had some changes to it, and this is all about identifying extra people at risk. In this case, you can see we're talking about people with PPE on. Previously wasn't there. When we're doing this risk assessment, we do take into account, or we need to take into account, it needs to be detailed, the wearing of RPE can affect how people can hear the alarm, see the alarm, and feel the alarm. All those cases, visual, audible, tactile. It also tells us specifically to consider health conditions or impairments. Okay, so it does put these questions within the risk assessment process, and it is something that we need to consider. It also, or you'll see through the document when you read it yourselves, and you'll see it through this presentation, consideration of neighbouring properties is a reoccurring theme in this current edition. Things such like petrol stations on the boundary of the construction site that we're building. Schools, we got special cases there. We do need to consider what is around and what our effect on their emergency plans might be. So if we're having an emergency, how we might affect them, how they might need to be affected. We need to collaborate, as was said earlier by the building coordinator. It's all got to be there. It's all part of a joined up picture. There are specific sections on timber frame buildings, but just a quick heads up. An off-site risk assessment must consider fire spread for large timber frame buildings. We have to look beyond the site boundary and outside of the control of us as principal contractors. So off-site risk assessments for fire spread are an absolute must on timber frame building sites. Step 5 then, last slide on the risk assessment section, is the addition of a new risk assessment checklist. It's quite good. It doesn't go into all the detail, but if you're following the checklist, you won't be omitting or missing anything out. So it's a good practical tool to be used. I'm now going to pick out some themes from part 2, which is detailed guidance around the fire risk assessment and also fire precautions. Again, I'm not going to go into all of the detail. I haven't got enough time, but we'll pick up the headlines. So, reducing ignition sources, and these are the sections that I'll break it down into. One to note for all you guys and girls on site, smoking. Where we do provide smoking facilities, we have to have a fire point at that location. Okay, it needs to be there. So it's one to consider when you're setting up your projects. Plant and equipment. There's new paragraphs that's been included discussing modern batteries and hydrogen equipment. I'm not going to go into that because I'm stealing other people's thunder later in the day. But it is something that we do need to consider. You'll probably notice a lot, and it's in the news. I think most of the train companies have stopped people bringing on the portable scooters, electric bikes, because there is inconsistency around the batteries, the state of the condition. Batteries exploded, cheap imports on batteries. We see it on our sites. We've had issues where we have the drive for lithium batteries and that sort of stuff to reduce our trailing cables. There's a lot of imported and, what's the word I'm looking for? Fake batteries, not from the manufacturers. They're cheaper, they're easier. There's not the quality control there. It does increase the risk. We need to understand how we can charge batteries on site. And as I've said, I'm not going to delve too much more into that. Now, you will notice throughout HSG 168, if you've looked at it at all, there's a lot of word changing, but not so much changing of the meaning. So when you read it, that's why it takes about 36 pages to list the changes. Titles have changed, words, paragraphs have been reordered. So it is worth getting your head into it. One of these changes is the title that used to be Oxy Fuel Equipment, the use of. It's now titled Hot Works. Hot Works I will discuss in more detail in the JCOP part of the presentation because there is a heavy change on that. But suffice to know, HSG 168, with its nod towards design, its focus on design, there is statements in there saying hot works should be designed out where practicable. The need for hot works must be justified using a design stage risk assessment and that information provided in pre-construction information. So, architects, designers, clients, what sort of roof are you putting on your high-rise? You need to make those decisions because guidance is telling us we don't want to be looking at hot work solutions there. Fit out stage, plumbing, etc. Can we have push fit rather than the brazing and the welding? It's all about getting rid of that ignition source. There's also recommendations for providing the use of combustible gas detectors, and thermal imaging cameras. I know Wates, we do insist on thermal imaging cameras, taking images at the end of or as part of our closing down of our hot works. It's in the document, it's recommending it. Most businesses now are using iPads or similar tablets with electronic systems. There's attachments now that you can fit into those. You don't need an extra thermal imaging camera. You can plot them in and get them into your system quite easily. There is some difference around Firewatch. It states Firewatch must now be maintained during breaks, previously not, and continuous Firewatch for 1 hour, and then checks at regular intervals for the second hour. So to finish hot works for the day takes at least 2 hours. So if you're finishing at 5, you need to be going into this process at 3 o'clock. Continual watch for an hour, and then we had to revisit during the second hour before we can start to close out the permit completely. Reducing potential fuel sources. There's a completely new section, I've touched on it already, modern batteries, fuel types, discussing hydrogen, gas and lithium-ion batteries, and DSEER, Dangerous Substances Explosive Atmosphere Regulations. So that is pulled into this document as well. There's a change of title around the volatile flammable materials, and this now becomes storage of volatile and flammable materials and gases under pressure. As you can see, the storage of volatile and flammable materials, the section has been rehashed. It essentially says the same thing, as do the precautions for all uses on gas cylinders. They've just reordered the paragraphs and there's a few changes in words. The context remains the same. Temporary site accommodation in similar areas becomes precautions for heating in temporary site accommodation in similar areas, with the addition that we do need to have a formal end of day check as part of our close down of our sites at the end of the day. That's now a requirement. Reducing potential fuel still, the section on LPG. This has had a lot of change, but it's generally titles. It has had an addition, and that addition is specific precautions for bitumen boilers. The guidance then indicates how these boilers should be lit up, removing the burner from underneath the boiler, then replacing it. It talks about braided hoses with a length of at least 4 meters. It talks about a pressure regulator of no more than 2 bar fitted to the gas cylinder. It also talks about, and this is a change to consider, at least 1 fire extinguisher. We've always had that, but it's now talking about including 2 boxes of sand as part of the requirement for hot bitumen work on roofs, if we haven't already eradicated it at the design stage, which is where the intent is. There's also a reference to the National Federation of Roofing Contractors publication, Safe to Torch. Are you familiar with that document, anybody in the crowd? It's worth looking up, it's a good document. Definitely one to use when you're managing bitumen works. It's a good document.
Book your tickets now for the 8th International Tall Building High-Rise Fire Safety Conference, taking place alongside FDIC in Indianapolis, US, on the 15th to the 17th of April 2024. 3 days of world-class speaker presentations, debates and networking. Book your tickets via the website www.tallbuildingfiresafety.com. Early bird discount tickets will be available. The tall and high-rise building fire safety management course is ideal for anyone who has responsibility for fire safety management in tall and high-rise buildings. It is a 5-day intensive course with world-class instructors. You can get full details of the course on our website www.tallbuildingfiresafety.com.
Continuing again with the fuel sources, it's a big section, but it's essentially name changing. Acetylene has been replaced, and this is now precautions for oxy-fuel cutting. There's a new section with regards to oxy-fuel gas cylinders, a new section specifically for acetylene cylinders within it. There's some further guidance on protective coverings. Before, it just quoted the loss prevention standard, but there are now equivalents in there, such as Technical Standard 63 and Certifier product certifications. So there are alternates suggested that can be used. It's worth looking at. Scaffold sheeting, I've fallen foul of this myself, doing a reclad job. It now specifically says we must not, where it was preferable not to sheet escape stairs, it's now a do not use sheeting to include on scaffold stairs. So it's out there, they are picking it up. As I've said, I've fallen foul of that myself. The demolition section has been broken down or removed and broken into underground gas services and the dismantling of tank structures. So a slight change. These headings were in it. There's just no longer a demolition section. It's underground gas services and dismantling of tank structures. Towards the back end of this section then, we're now looking at general fire precautions. The main thing to pick out of general fire precautions is it now includes reference to fire detection in the list of things to be considered and to be implemented as general fire precautions. There's some more clarification around means of escape. Specifically, no flammable or combustible materials are temporarily or permanently stored in any means of escape. Common sense, really, and should they need to tell us? Probably not. But obviously, what we see is not this occurring. Material space on site is always at a premium. We have to ensure that those escape routes are clear. Another big difference then is travel distances. When you open it up, you'll notice it's only now talking about enclosed structures. There is a paragraph talking about open concrete frame at that stage, but the escape distances are now specific for when we're enclosing the structure. Emergency lighting, it's always been there, but there is now an addition that we must test to ensure that it's compliant and working when we start to extend those lighting circuits up the structure. So as we put lighting in, any new components are added, it needs to be retested. Fire alarms, I spoke about it just a moment ago. We do need to consider the use of automatic fire detectors during construction. I'm sure when you're out there we're doing it anyway, but this can buy us more time to get out of the building in the first instance. However, where we do have them, we need to manage them. We need to ensure we're not having false alarms by having dust set them off, or we're having the dust, etc., extracted. As, again, we expand the system up the building, we do need to ensure when we're adding extra parts that, again, the installation is tested and it's a competent person. You heard the theme earlier. It's all about competent people is installing the system. Completely new section on composite building panels. And obviously this comes in following lessons learned. With composite panels, incorrect installation such as poor joint detailing and inadequate support can lead to exposed combustible materials that is vulnerable to fire. In the construction phase, consider eliminating sources of ignition during the removal and installation of composite panels. Obviously, this includes methods of cutting that create sparks, avoiding methods of fixing that involve flammable solvents, and minimising hot works as a means of drying the surface before the panel is fixed. Just out of interest, anybody currently running recladding projects? It's an interesting one. Have you had your visit from the HSE? Okay. They generally try and get to all recladding projects. It is a firm but fair inspection, and they do open your eyes to a few things. We need to manage any works on or near installed composite building panels carefully to ensure that the core of the panel is not left exposed and gaps are filled. So what that essentially meant, and what we got from our visit, if we've completely declad the building, or if we are stripping it down, any edges that we get to need to be sealed with temporary fire stopping, fire paper, etc. before we finish for the night. It has to be good in its condition before we leave that site. So again, it's about planning our works to ensure that we can make it fire tight again before we leave the project. We can't just get to a point, it gets to 5 o'clock, that's it, we've got a whole exposed edge or a whole exposed top, which is exposing combustible materials behind it. It does take some careful planning. It's very easy for people to get caught out when they start getting behind. So it is absolutely critical to manage that process. There is a section on timber frame buildings, and basically this section has been updated in accordance with the Structural Timber Association's 16 steps to fire safety and design guide. Okay, if you do timber frame, this is one to have a look at specifically. Process fire precautions for high-rise buildings. One to be aware of again, it's becoming common practice at the moment for basically the client to want to get people into those high-rise as soon as possible. This then presents a very interesting scenario because we then start to fall under two different regulators. During construction, we're under the HSE for the construction phase, but then we're moving into the fire regulator for people that are moving in and all the areas in between, the lifts, the shafts. My advice to you, obviously this does need to be detailed in pre-construction information, but you will need specialist advice on how to manage these works. So be aware, if that's what you're doing, you do need to seek that advice. Fire engineering solutions, etc. They're two different beasts, two different authorities, and obviously we have people sleeping on partially completed above them anyway. The fire systems have to be complete where they are. It's an interesting beast. Okay, just to kind of finish off the HSG 168 section, there have been an update on a few legal and enforcement responsibilities. I'm not going to go into detail on these other than to say the Fire Safety Act 2021 makes some changes around the fire safety order, specifically around the definition of an external walls. Why is this interesting? Because we might have it scaffolding around the outside. This might go over the boundary in smaller developments. This is classed as the external wall. So there's some interesting party wall discussions and accountabilities there. We've got the Fire Safety Regulation 2022 coming into, or have come into force, reinforcing CDM duty holders, that's spoken about already, and then finally, dangerous substances can put people at risk from fire and explosion. More about that through the batteries, the electronic charging, etc. as we move through. Okay then, that was a very quick whistle-stop through HSG 168. I'm now going to do the same, but not for quite as long, with regards to the JCOP. Now the JCOP, so the HSG is a health and safety guidance predominantly regarding life safety. The Joint Code of Practice is an insurance-led document from the insurance companies, and whilst it obviously still deals with life safety, also deals with building safety. It came about because obviously we had two major fires, shall we say, brought this in the 90s, and rather than a huge hike in premiums, who knew that insurance companies had a conscience, they decided to bring out a set of rules which, if you work within the guidelines, you should be all right. It is worth pointing out in this case, though, you need to check with whoever is your insurer as to the specific standards they're looking for. This is the guidance. They might have a little bit of difference. The other thing to add is most insurance companies, when the change happened, brought out some really good guidance, some really good gap analysis on what has changed from their point of view. Some of them have gone as far as to put deadlines and lines in dates for implementation within their policies. So find out who your insurer is, AXA, QBE, whoever it might be. Have a look at it. They might have timescales for what should be implemented and when. So again, an overview. So provision for combustible materials. We spoke about it a little bit just then with the cladding, but we do need to consider combustible materials, especially in cladding, where we're removing existing fire protection, that once it's not compact and contained within a sandwich, becomes very combustible. We can't have this stored on that project overnight. You need to get rid of it. Okay, another bit of practical experience from having reclab projects inspected. The insulation needs to be off-site and away from it same day. Impairment of fire systems. So there's a new section around when existing fire precautions, if we're doing cut and carve, or if we've got partially occupied buildings, how to manage the impairment of fire alarms, emergency lights, sprinkler systems. Essentially what it says is effective supervision and the safe shutdown of the systems. Ensure that there is an effective control over potential fire hazards during that impairment, and ultimately try and reduce the duration of the impairment by reinstating protection as soon as possible. So, where we start to switch systems off, make sure there's a process for switching them back on. It needs to go from A to Z and back again. Make sure we don't leave them switched off. Finally, there's a bit of detailed guidance or reference to British Standards EN 12845, Annex J, which is specifically to do with the impairment of sprinkler systems. And as I'm sure, if you're doing high-rise, if we've got basements that have got car parks in, it's now part of building regs, and we now need to have a look at that. A little bit more detail then on temporary protected coverings. Well, a little bit more detail than HSG 168. In particular, specifying that any hard boarding that we're using must meet Class A2, S1 or D0, or better, under the British Standard 1351, Section 1. So, again, general guidance in HSG 168, a little bit more specific in the Joint Code. Check with your insurance companies. Portable fire extinguishers. What the JCOP is now asking us to do is have a register of fire extinguishers that are brought onto site. Obviously, this is to ensure that maintenance and they're good and fit to use when they need to be used. Hopefully never. But they are asking us to register and clearly label for which use, which should be a matter of course, by the principal contractor. Site security against arson. Some changes in this one. It's now talking about licensed personnel, approved companies, working to BS standards 7944, video surveillance systems, systems that are remotely activate when people move on them. So, absolutely, we need to consider that, and I've seen it, Russ, so I'm working towards it. Temporary buildings, again, there's now an inclusion to European standards, although we've left Europe, there is reference to it. And an important one, in your site canteens, insurance companies no longer the use of deep fat fryers. Installation of all cooking equipment must be done by competent installers. Hotworks then, as I'm working through, we must be trained. We must have the right people inside there. Frequent refresher training must take on. Hotworks permits must cover specific activities, no longer blanket permits. Also ensure that the permits are for a specific period of time. Specific activity, specific period of time. And make sure that the closeout of the inspections are recorded by a senior person. There's a recommendation there on a minimum 13A rating for all fire points, and there's some recommendation and guidance around screening for hotworks, talking about using some maybe fire sheeting as well as hard board where applicable. Firewatch, completely rewritten. This is much more specific and requires additional checks. And in that second hour, and this is the base level, these, whereas HSG says it must be revisited, Joint Code says every 20 minutes in the second hour, there must be a revisit, a check, a look at all the areas and the works around it. Again, pushing the use of photography and thermal imaging. And then finally, Firewatch, as described, the Firewatch period should be extended in circumstances where a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment undertaken by a competent person has deemed it necessary. The minimum is 2 hours. It might need to be more, considering what's around in the environment of those hotworks. Waste materials then, I've touched on it really. It's talking about combustible insulation material. We need to get it off-site. We need to get our waste collected off-site. It needs to be in metal containers with lids on, so nothing can fall in and start a fire. Electrical charging, I'm not going to be talking about that. Other people will be later. There is a small amendment on high-rise construction, and this is that all fire-stopping material for both integrity and insulation must now meet 60 minutes fire resistance. 30 minutes is gone. Talks about fire detection, paying particular area or interest on temporary fire loading. So once we start to lose the cranes on site, we have that rush to fit the project out, get all the materials up before the crane goes. We now need to manage those areas. We might need to be covering materials, ideally putting fire detection in these sources, these locations. And then finally, a slight little change around wet rising mains to bring the Joint Code of Practice in line with the approved document B. Fire on timber frames I've spoke about already. So, in summary then, many changes to both documents, major update on hotworks. Please be aware, these are the headlines only. I'm kind of right on the board with time now. The devil is in the detail. There is more to look at. Most insurance companies have circulated a gap analysis of JCOP and timeline for implementation. Find out who your insurer is, get a copy of it, and ultimately, stay safe and fire free. Thank you very much.
Book your tickets now for the 8th International Tall Building High-Rise Fire Safety Conference, taking place alongside FDIC in Indianapolis, US, on the 15th to the 17th of April 2024. 3 days of world-class speaker presentations, debates and networking. Book your tickets via the website www.tallbuildingfiresafety.com. Early bird discount tickets will be available. The tall and high-rise building fire safety management course is ideal for anyone who has responsibility for fire safety management in tall and high-rise buildings. It is a 5-day intensive course with world-class instructors. You can get full details of the course on our website www.tallbuildingfiresafety.com.